Winter, 1942. The outskirts of Stalingrad had become a frozen hell where time itself seemed to crystallize in the breath of dying men. The temperature had plummeted to minus 40 degrees Celsius, cold enough to freeze the oil in rifle mechanisms and crack the metal of tank armor. In this white wasteland, a new kind of predator had emerged, one that German soldiers had come to fear more than artillery barrages or tank columns. They called them the ghosts of Stalingrad, but they were something much more tangible. Soviet snipers who had turned psychological warfare into an art form as deadly as their marksmanship. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ruined landscape of what had once been the industrial district of Stalingrad. Vasily Zaitsev exhaled slowly, watching his breath form a small cloud that quickly dissipated in the frigid air. He had been in position since before dawn, perfectly still despite the biting cold that threatened to freeze his very blood. The abandoned factory building offered a perfect vantage point over a German-held sector where supply trucks arrived each morning. Through his scope, he could see the enemy soldiers moving with increasing caution, their heads turning nervously at every sound, their eyes scanning the ruins around them with the frantic energy of hunted animals. Zaitsev allowed himself a small smile. The fear was working. 3 weeks earlier, he had been just another soldier in the Red Army, fighting desperately to hold Stalingrad against the relentless German advance. Now, he was something else entirely. A symbol, a weapon of terror that kept German soldiers awake at night, afraid to stand near windows or cross open spaces. His tally had reached 84 confirmed kills, but the true value of his work went far beyond the numbers. It was about the whispers that spread through German lines, the paranoia that slowed their movements and fractured their resolve. The Soviet command had recognized this power and formalized it into what they called the Fear Factory, a psychological operation that weaponized the terror of invisible death. The German officers on the opposite side of the Volga River were facing a crisis of morale that no amount of propaganda or discipline could fully address. Hauptmann Werner Keller stood in the basement of what had once been a grain storage facility, now serving as a temporary headquarters for his increasingly demoralized company. The walls were covered with maps of Stalingrad's industrial district, marked with red circles indicating areas where snipers had struck. There were far too many circles. "We lost another 8 men yesterday," reported Feldwebel Schmidt, his voice hollow with exhaustion. 3 of them to headshots while they were retrieving water. "The men are refusing to move during daylight hours." Keller nodded grimly. "What about the counter-snipers we requested from Berlin?" Schmidt's expression darkened further. "They're coming, sir, but it will take time. Command doesn't fully understand what we're dealing with here." What they were dealing with was not just skilled marksmen, but a carefully orchestrated campaign of terror. Soviet snipers worked in pairs, a shooter and a spotter, relocating constantly to avoid detection. They left small tokens behind in areas they had targeted. A spent cartridge placed carefully on a windowsill, a German helmet with a clean hole drilled through it positioned where it would be found, or sometimes just a piece of paper with a number representing their kill count. These physical reminders served as psychological anchors for the fear, making it impossible for German soldiers to escape the feeling of being watched, even when they were in supposedly secure areas. The tokens became known as calling cards, and finding one was often enough to send hardened veterans into panic. In the Soviet trenches, a new sniper was being prepared for his first mission. Alexei Voronin had been a hunter before the war, known in his village for his ability to track wolves through the forests outside Kursk. Now, his instructor was Senior Lieutenant Olga Petrova, one of the few female snipers who had already achieved legendary status among both Soviet and German forces. "The rifle is only half the weapon," she explained, her voice soft but intense as she checked the sight alignment on his Mosin Nagant. "The other half is in here." She tapped her temple with a gloved finger. "The Germans have better equipment, better supplies, but we have broken their minds. When a German soldier hears a comrade fall, he freezes. When he finds one of our tokens, he trembles. This fear slows them down, makes them hesitate, turns their movements clumsy. And in that moment of hesitation, that is when we take them." Olga had pioneered many of the psychological tactics that had proven so effective. She had been the first to suggest leaving the small metal stars from Soviet uniforms near the bodies of snipers' victims, a signature that quickly became associated with certain death. As German soldiers began to recognize these symbols, the mere sight of them would trigger panic. She had also developed the technique of targeting officers first, then medics. and finally leaving the wounded to cry out for extended periods before taking the soldiers who came to their aid. The calculated cruelty of this approach had proven devastatingly effective at breaking unit cohesion. "Today, you will not fire a single shot," she told Alexei. "Today, you will learn to create fear." Meanwhile, deep within the labyrinth of destroyed factories, Commissar Ivan Danilov was coordinating the larger psychological campaign that supported the snipers' work. Danilov had been a professor of psychology at Moscow University before the war, specializing in fear responses. Now, he applied his academic knowledge to the grim science of breaking enemy morale. The German mind is particularly vulnerable to certain types of psychological pressure, he explained to a group of snipers gathered in the relative warmth of an underground bunker. They are trained to believe in order, in the superiority of their tactical doctrine. When that order is disrupted, when they cannot identify or counter a threat, it creates a cognitive dissonance that manifests as extreme stress. The commissar unfolded a map across a makeshift table. "We have identified the locations where German troops gather to receive mail from home. These are to be our next targets, not for kills, but for fear." The operation Danilov described involved snipers positioning themselves to observe the mail distribution points without firing. Instead, they would use their spotting scopes to identify individual soldiers, noting distinctive features or behaviors. The next day, those same soldiers would find notes left in their positions, notes that described what they had been wearing, who they had spoken to, what letters or packages they had received. The notes would be written in German, with just enough errors to make it clear they came from Russian speakers. The message was simple: "We see everything. We could have killed you at any moment. Your life continues only by our choice." This tactic, which they called the observer's game, had proven so effective at inducing panic that several German soldiers had taken their own lives rather than continue to endure the psychological torment. Across the city, in the German-held territory, Oberst Karl Kleinmann had been dispatched from Berlin with a special assignment to eliminate the Soviet sniper threat and restore German morale. Kleinmann was a tall, austere man with cold eyes and a reputation for ruthless efficiency. He had brought with him a team of 20 elite marksmen from the Eastern Front Sniper School, each equipped with the latest Mauser rifles and telescopic sights superior to anything the Soviets possessed. "The Russian sniper is not superhuman," he told his assembled team in the basement of a bombed-out church. "He is not a ghost or a demon. He is a man with a rifle, and men can be killed." Despite his confident words, Kleinmann knew that he was facing something unprecedented. The reports he had read during the journey to Stalingrad had disturbed him deeply, not because of the tactical situation, which was challenging but manageable, but because of the psychological collapse he was witnessing in the Wehrmacht's troops. Hardened veterans who had fought from Poland to the gates of Moscow were breaking down, refusing orders, even shooting at shadows. It was as if the Russian winter had somehow crept into their minds, freezing their courage and clarity of thought. Kleinmann's counteroffensive began with a systematic approach to sniper detection. He established observation posts with multiple spotters, each assigned to scan different sectors of the Soviet-held areas. He implemented strict protocols for movement. No one was to establish patterns. All essential transit was to happen in darkness or under smoke cover. And most importantly, no one was to retrieve fallen comrades until the sniper's position had been identified and neutralized. These measures were tactically sound, but they failed to address the deeper psychological damage that had already been inflicted. His men moved with the jerky hypervigilance of prey animals, their nerves frayed to breaking point by the constant strain of feeling watched. In the Soviet positions, Zaitsev had been informed of the arrival of the German counter-sniper team. Far from being concerned, he saw it as an opportunity to escalate the psychological campaign. "They have sent their best hunters to find us," he told his fellow snipers during a rare gathering in a basement shelter. "This means we have already won the first battle, the battle for their attention. Now we will win the second battle, the battle for their minds." His plan was audacious in its simplicity. Rather than hiding from the German counter-snipers, they would hunt them, deliberately leaving evidence of their observations. Each morning, the Germans would find new calling cards in positions their snipers had occupied the previous day, evidence that they themselves were being stalked. It was a reversal of the hunter-prey relationship that struck at the core of the German sniper's professional identity. As the psychological battle intensified, Individual engagements took on an almost mythic quality. In the ruins of the Barakati factory, a duel developed between Olga Petrova and a German sniper identified only as the surgeon for his precise headshots. For 6 days, they stalked each other through the shattered industrial landscape, neither able to gain a decisive advantage. On the 7th day, Olga employed a tactic that had never been documented in sniper warfare before. She arranged a collection of small mirrors salvaged from destroyed buildings, positioning them to catch and reflect small flashes of light across multiple points in the factory ruins. These unpredictable glints mimicked the reflection of sunlight off a telescopic sight, creating the illusion of multiple snipers moving through the complex. As the surgeon's attention was divided between these phantom threats, Olga remained perfectly still, in a position she had prepared 3 days earlier, inside the rusted hull of a destroyed T-34 tank. When the surgeon finally moved to investigate one of the light sources, she took her shot. The psychological component of the kill was as important as the marksmanship. The German counter-sniper team found their comrade with a small mirror placed on his chest, reflecting the winter sun upward like an accusation. The Soviet psychological tactics continued to evolve as the battle for Stalingrad ground on. One particularly effective technique became known as the voice. Soviet scouts would infiltrate close enough to German positions to hear names being called, orders being given, or conversations between soldiers. Snipers would then use this information to call out in German during the night, sometimes imitating officers giving contradictory orders, sometimes calling to specific soldiers by name, describing details of their home lives gleaned from intercepted mail. This disembodied voice, coming from the darkness beyond their positions, had a profoundly unsettling effect on German troops already stressed to the breaking point. Some began to believe that the Russians had some form of supernatural ability to read minds or see in complete darkness. The rational explanation, careful observation, and intelligence gathering was in some ways more terrifying than the superstitions, as it highlighted the thoroughness with which they were being studied by their invisible hunters. Within 6 weeks of the specialized German counter-sniper team's arrival, 15 of the original 20 had been killed, 4 had been wounded severely enough to be evacuated, and 1 had disappeared under circumstances that suggested desertion. Oberst Kleinman himself was found dead in what was supposed to be a secure command post, with a single bullet hole through his forehead and a Soviet sniper's calling card, a small metal star, placed between his stiffening fingers. The psychological impact of this kill reverberated through the entire German 6th Army. If their elite counter-snipers could not protect themselves, what hope did ordinary infantry have? The German High Command responded with increasingly desperate measures. They issued darkened face paint to reduce the visibility of exposed skin, distributed camouflage materials previously reserved for specialized units, and even attempted to implement a system of randomized movements designed by mathematicians to make soldier patterns unpredictable. None of these technical solutions addressed the core psychological damage that had been inflicted. The Soviet snipers had created a climate of fear so pervasive that it had become self-sustaining. German soldiers were now triggering false alarms, firing at shadows and reporting sniper sightings, even in areas where no Soviet marksmen were operating. The fear had become a virus that spread through their own communication channels. As January 1943 arrived with even more brutal cold, the psychological component of the sniper campaign reached its zenith in what would later be called Operation Whisper. Using intelligence gathered from multiple sources, Soviet snipers compiled detailed information about specific German officers and NCOs, their habits, their personal histories, their relationships with other soldiers. Then, during the coldest nights when the temperature plunged to lethal levels, they would infiltrate close enough to German shelters to whisper through cracks in the walls or broken windows. These whispers contained personal details that seemed impossible for an enemy to know. Names of distant hometowns, references to specific incidents in training, mentions of family members or sweethearts. The effect was devastating on men already suffering from cold, hunger, and exhaustion. Several cases were documented of German soldiers firing on their own comrades, convinced that Russians had somehow infiltrated their ranks, or that fellow soldiers were collaborating with the enemy. By the time the German 6th Army surrendered in February 1943, the sniper units had achieved a psychological victory, as significant as any tactical success. The fear they had instilled had accelerated the collapse of German morale, created friction between officers and enlisted men, and degraded combat effectiveness across the entire Stalingrad pocket. In the aftermath of the battle, Soviet military psychologists conducted interviews with German prisoners to assess the impact of the sniper campaign. What they discovered was a form of collective trauma specific to Stalingrad veterans, a hypervigilance that persisted even in captivity, a tendency to avoid open spaces, and a startling prevalence of nightmares featuring unseen watchers. The psychological wounds inflicted by the campaign proved more resistant to healing than many physical injuries. The techniques pioneered at Stalingrad were refined and formalized into Soviet sniper doctrine for the remainder of the war. Training programs for new snipers now included psychological components alongside marksmanship, how to select targets for maximum psychological impact, how to leave evidence of observation without taking a shot, how to use minimal force to create maximum fear. A manual distributed to sniper teams on the Leningrad front included a quote attributed to Zaitsev: "The purpose of a sniper is not to kill the body, but to destroy the mind." A dead enemy can no longer fight, but a terrified enemy infects all around him with his fear. As the Red Army pushed westward toward Berlin, the reputation of Soviet snipers preceded them. German units that had never encountered them directly nevertheless modified their behaviors based on stories heard from Stalingrad survivors, limiting movement during daylight hours, avoiding established patterns, treating open areas with extreme caution. In this way, the psychological impact extended far beyond the actual operational range of the sniper teams themselves. Fear had become a force multiplier that allowed a relatively small number of specialized marksmen to influence the behavior of entire divisions. The legacy of these psychological tactics extended beyond World War II, influencing military doctrine throughout the Cold War and into modern conflicts. The Soviet approach demonstrated that precision violence, carefully targeted and psychologically amplified, could achieve effects disproportionate to the resources invested. More importantly, it established that in modern warfare, the mind of the enemy was as legitimate and vulnerable a target as their body. The fear factory of Stalingrad had manufactured a product with remarkable durability. The understanding that terror is contagious, that uncertainty erodes resolve more effectively than brute force, and that imagination can transform a single bullet into 1,000 perceived threats. In the official Soviet military history of the Battle of Stalingrad, the sniper campaign received relatively little attention compared to the massive tank engagements or artillery barrages. The psychological component was mentioned only in passing, perhaps because it seemed too intangible compared to more measurable metrics of success, like territory gained or enemy equipment destroyed. But in the memoirs of those who survived the frozen hell of that winter, both Russian and German, the unseen hunters and the fear they created feature prominently. As one German survivor wrote years later, "The bullets we could hear, we could survive, was the bullets we imagined that defeated us." Today, as military technology has evolved to create greater distance between combatants, the psychological insights developed by those Soviet snipers remain relevant. The power of uncertainty, the corrosive effect of persistent threat, and the vulnerability of the human mind to fear are constants that transcend changes in weaponry or tactics. The winter of Stalingrad has passed into history, but the whispers in the darkness continue to echo in the doctrine of modern psychological operations worldwide. The story of Soviet snipers and their psychological warfare is not merely a historical curiosity, but a stark reminder of war's complexity beyond the physical battlefield. It demonstrates how combat exists simultaneously in multiple dimensions, not just the physical exchange of fire, but the cognitive battle for certainty, the emotional struggle against fear, and the social contest for unit cohesion and resolve. In this multidimensional understanding of conflict, the Soviet snipers achieved a form of victory that conventional military analysis struggles to quantify, but that proved decisive nonetheless. If the battles of yesterday offer lessons for tomorrow, perhaps the most important insight from the sniper war at Stalingrad is the recognition that human psychology remains the terrain on which all other forms of warfare ultimately unfold. The mind, with its capacity for both courage and fear, rational analysis and superstitious terror, is the final battlefield. And on that battlefield, the perception of threat can prove as decisive as any physical weapon. The frozen ruins of Stalingrad have long since been rebuilt, the bullet holes plastered over, the blood washed away by 7 decades of rain and snow. But somewhere in those reconstructed streets, the ghosts of fear still linger, a testament to a time when the most powerful weapon in a sniper's arsenal was not the rifle in his hands, but the uncertainty he created in the minds of his enemies. In that uncertainty lay a terrible power, the power to transform a single soldier with a simple weapon into a force that could shape the behavior of thousands. And in that transformation lies a warning that echoes across time. In the psychology of warfare, it is not the damage we sustain that defeats us, but the damage we imagine awaits.